Now let's come to electronic evidence. Now we all know technology has evolved rapidly in recent times, so it is bound to be recognized by courts. Now the Indian Evidence Act was amended in 2000. Section 3 of the Indian Evidence Act was amended to include all documents, including electronic records. Therefore, just like other evidence, electronic evidence or digital evidence is also considered as evidence admissible in court if it is relevant and not against any factors of inspection of the court. Now, as per the Information Technology Act, electronic records include data, sound, image generated or recorded, and sent or received in electronic form. So basically, the term e-evidence, it can be expanded to mean electronic or digital evidence. In today's world, because all of us use the internet, mobile phones, various applications like Facebook, Snapchat, Twitter, Instagram, the footages or snaps or call records obtained from sources that are authentic in nature can be produced before the court to prove an accused's guilt and are relevant and admissible and are colloquially termed as e-evidence. Now, examples of electronic evidence are the data stored in a computer system. Now, it is well recognized principle of law that where primary evidence is available, it will obviously be given priority over secondary evidence. Now, sometimes the data relating to primary evidence, which is in electronic form, as we all know, can be stored in a cloud or a Google Drive or else on a hard disk, which sometimes makes it impractical to get it to court. We can't get the cloud to court or like a huge hard disk. Therefore, a standard procedure was laid down wherein secondary evidence was also held admissible in cases where primary evidence could not, which was in electronic form, could not be produced in court. Now, secondary evidence could be printed on paper. It can be stored, recorded, or copied in a USB, a pen drive, a CD. These computer outputs will only be admissible after satisfying the conditions under Section 65B of Evidence Act. For electronic evidence, you just need to see Section 65A and 65B. Now, these conditions are to be complied with only in the case of secondary evidence, which is of electronic form, and not in the case of primary evidence. Now, let's start with, say, a CD or a hard drive or a memory chip. These kind of electronic records are admissible as primary as well as secondary evidence. Now, an example of a primary evidence would be if I was recording something through my handy cam and a crime scene was recorded in that handy cam, the entire handy cam along with the CD or cassette, whichever model, I hand it over to the court as evidence. That is primary evidence. What is secondary evidence is what is copied onto another device. Say I take that handycam, I plug it into my computer, I download it onto my computer. Thereafter, I transfer it to a pen drive, and that pen drive I give it to the court. That is considered as secondary evidence. Now, in the case of, say, CCTV footages, again stored in virtual platforms like a cloud or a server, you cannot take that to court. That is also transferred into a pen drive, and that pen drive would be placed in court, and under certain specifications under Section 65B, if they are complied with, it will be admissible. So it's basically clear that when the data is self-generated and recorded without any human intervention, it's primary evidence. But when a data is transferred or it's copied to another electronic device with some human intervention doing it, there's always an iota possibility of someone tampering with that, right? I can easily cut a video clip. I can cut one part of a video clip, merge two clips together and make it seem like a whole different incident. Therefore, that is known as secondary evidence once human intervention has come in terms of transferring it. To prove the genuineness of it is where Section 65B comes in. I'll get to Section 65B in a bit. Let's talk about audio and video recordings also. Now, original audio and video recordings are accepted as valid source of evidence. Tape recordings are recognized if they are considered relevant to the case. Tape recordings come under the ambit of documents under Section 3 of Evidence Act. As audio tapes could be altered, erased, or re-recorded, while accepting them as evidence, there are certain factors which need to be considered. Say now I've recorded a conversation, right, of someone accepting a bribe. What needs to be considered at the time of admitting this tape record into evidence? First is the voice of the speaker must be duly identified by the maker of the recorder or by any person who recognizes the voice. So if I'm the perpetrator, my voice has to be recognized by another individual who will come to court and depose stating that, yes, I know Lakshmi's voice because I know her for so and so years. This is definitely her voice on the recording. Second is that every possibility of tampering with a part of a tape recorded statement must be ruled out. Otherwise, it may render the statement as out of context. As I said, you can easily trim out one part of a video, join two videos, make it look normal. So every possibility must be ruled out in terms of tampering with it. The statement must be relevant, of course, according to the Evidence Act, then only can it be admissible. The recorded cassette must be carefully sealed and kept in safe custody. The voice of the speaker should be clearly audible. For a tape recorded conversation to be admitted in evidence, if there is any distorted voice, it will be held inadmissible. It needs to be clearly audible to any person without any disturbances. Now, a Supreme Court in a case of Yusuf Ali Nagre versus State of Maharashtra, wherein police had laid down a trap and a tape recorder was used to record a conversation between the accused who was offering a bribe and another person. The fact of what Kushal had spoken about of Article 20, Subclause 3 of self-incrimination, whether this would come into play over here. It was held by the Supreme Court that the accused could not claim protection under self-incrimination, even though he was recorded, on the ground of deception, because he was never compelled to be a witness. That is exactly what Article 20, Subclause 3 talks about. He was freely and voluntarily talking to another person. Yes, he was not aware that it was being recorded. However, whatever was spoken was voluntary. The process of tape recording offers an accurate method of storing and later reproducing sounds. So that imprint on the magnetic tape is the direct effect of the relevant sound. So just like you take a photograph of a crime scene, the tape recorder of a relevant conversation is considered a relevant fact and is therefore admissible under Section 7 of Indian Evidence Act. Hence, it is clear that though the tape recorded conversation cannot be an independent evidence, it is used to corroborate and it can be admissible in evidence. It is sufficient to launch a prosecution. Now, as much as video recordings are concerned, they hold the same evidentiary value as that of audio recordings. As I've spoken about, say, a video recording in the form of a media file generated by a handycam or a CCTV footage. Now, there is no doubt in pertaining to its admissibility. It's just the mode in which it is given to the court. I can submit the handycam with the memory chip. That would be primary evidence. If that is not available or I cannot practically put it in court, I create it through a secondary evidence. That secondary evidence has to meet certain tests as mentioned under Section 65B. Now, with respect to video conferencing in courts, which may be more relevant in these times, the court has held that the physical presence of a person in court may not be required for the purpose of adducing evidence, and the same can be done through a medium like video conferencing. Again, Section 65A and B provide for the provisions for evidences relating to the electronic record. The Supreme Court has observed that video conferencing is an advancement of science and technology, which permits seeing, hearing, and talking with someone who's not physically present. The legal requirement for the presence of the witness does not actually mean physical evidence, is what Supreme Court has held. So therefore, the court allowed examination of witnesses through video conferencing and concluded that there's no reason why examination of witness by video conferencing should not be an essential part of electronic evidence. Before a witness is examined, in terms of it's called an audio-video link, the witness has to file an affidavit or an undertaking duly verified before a notary or a judge in his jurisdiction, wherever he is sitting and testifying from, that the person who is shown as the witness, say I am deposing as a witness right now, person who is shown as the witness is the same person who's going to depose in the screen. And that copy must be obviously available to the other side. That is called an identification affidavit, that I, Lakshmi Raman, am the same person who's going to be deposing before the court. Now, the person who examines the witness on the screen is also to file an affidavit. The person who's in the courtroom has to also file an affidavit before examining the witness with a copy to the other side with respect to his identification. The witness has to be examined during court working hours. Oath has to be administered through the media. The witness should not plead any inconvenience on account of time difference in case he or she is abroad. Before examination of the witness, all relevant documents have to be produced, given to him. The judge is to record such remarks as is material regarding the demeanor of the witness. Sometimes if I'm the victim, I'm a rape victim, and I'm deposing before court, and I'm stuttering while deposing, that goes to show that I'm scared about talking about that incident. And if I were actually in court, the judge would have recorded my demeanor. That does not stop a judge from recording it just because it's on video conference. Therefore, the judge has to carefully pay attention to my demeanor as well while I'm deposing and record the necessary observations. Moreover, the judge must also record and note the objections which are raised during recording of witnesses and decide the same at the time of the arguments. After recording the evidence, however it has been recorded, has to be sent to the witness, wherein I see it and my signature is taken in front of a notary public. And thereafter, it forms a part of record. Now, the visual that you see, the camera, it's to be recorded, and it will be recorded on both ends. That means the video is recorded at the court and it is recorded from where I'm deposing at both ends. And both have to be supplied to both the parties. Now, the judge may also impose certain conditions as in and required depending on facts of the case. The expenses and arrangements of this is borne by the person who wants to avail an opportunity of this video conferencing. Okay, now we'll talk about evidence in form of emails. In terms of your cell phone, it will include your emails, your SMS, WhatsApp messages, Twitter messages, on Facebook, your messenger. Now there's a presumption under section 88A of the Evidence Act, which the court follows while taking emails and such chats as evidence. This presumption is only pertaining to the data fed into the computer and not in relation to the originator of the email. So what is presumed is not who has sent it. What is presumed is that I have it, I have received it on my email ID. So it is presumed that this was sent to me itself. The source of it is not recognized. As to who the person is who sent it, that has not yet been proved. So emails are generally submitted by way of printouts along with the certification under section 65B, which I'm going to come to. Now, mobile phones also can be very useful and resourceful when it comes to evidentiary value. As per section 2T of the Information Technology Act, mobile is the computer and SMS in the mobile is an electronic record. Therefore, it is admissible in evidence. Mobile phones can be used for tracing location, call records, submitting media like pictures and videos. If media files which are generated through mobile phones are to be submitted in court as evidence, then in those cases, the mobile phone along with the memory card, if any, which was used to store it, has to be submitted to court. Now, media generated through mobile phones can also be submitted like secondary evidence. If I submit my mobile phone itself, that's primary evidence. Evidence wherein I transfer, say, a picture that I captured on my mobile into a pen drive, that would, of course, be secondary evidence again. Now, as per Section 73A of the Evidence Act, for the purpose of ascertaining whether a digital signature belongs to a person, the court may direct the person or the controller or the certifying authority to produce the digital signature certificate. Every digital signature has a certificate. So to prove that this was the person who digitally signed it, you can call that controller who will show the certificate, and thereafter that would be admissible. Now let's come to Section 65B. It talks about the admissibility of electronic record in court proceedings with respect to secondary evidence. It states that any record which is contained in any electronic or digital format shall be termed as document. If the terms specified in Section 65B of the said Act are satisfied by such a document, then it shall be necessarily admissible in court proceedings without any proving of such document in the future. Now, what are the conditions? First is the information shall be produced during regular course of activities by the person having lawful control over the use of the computer. It should be proved that I am the owner of my cell phone. I would use it during my regular activities, and therefore that video I have captured. The information has been regularly fed into the computer in ordinary course of activities. Throughout the material part of the said period, the computer was operating properly. It did not conk off in between, or the improper operation was not of such nature to affect the electronic or digital record or the accuracy of the contents produced. The information contained in the electronic or digital records is derived from such information fed into the computer in the ordinary course of an individual's activities. Now, to prove the secondary evidence, what is to be submitted is a certificate under Section 65B. Now, by certificate, it is actually in the form of a prescribed affidavit, wherein the person states that, yeah, it was on my phone. The certain, say I took a photo or video of a crime scene, I have to put it on record on affidavit that I had captured it on my phone model, make, IMEI number. Thereafter, I have transferred the file into my laptop, the laptop's make, model number, and of course to print it out, I used a printer. Therefore, the printer's make and model number. After stating all these requirements, you have to also state that I am the sole owner of my phone, my computer, and my printer. It has not been touched by anyone else. This is to show that it has not been tampered with. So this comes under Section 65B, subclause 4. So if evidence is adduced during any proceeding before a court by virtue of this section, then the certificate needs to state these points. One is it identifies the electronic record containing the statement. It identifies the mobile. Certificate must describe the manner in which it was produced in terms of printing it out. The certificate, which is actually just an affidavit only, the certificate must furnish the particulars of the device involved, as I said, make and model number. Certificate must deal with the applicable conditions mentioned under Section 65B2, and the certificate must be signed by the person occupying a responsible official position. It was my mobile, so I will sign it and state that yes, only I was in use of it. Now, what is the point of all this? It is to prove the integrity of the data. Like every evidence, the mode of how it came to court is what is most important. So the integrity of the data, wherein the data is sent or recorded, was intact and not tampered with. The integrity of the hardware or software, which was used in downloading it from the computer, was functional. It was not tampered with. There was no corruption, no virus, nothing which could alter an electronic document. And the security of the system, that there was no other person who has accessed this apart from me. So all this is mentioned basically in under Section 65B, and this is what your certificate must contain. in terms of secondary evidence. And that is when you submit this. So therefore, I'll just conclude by saying that evidence is the most integral and indispensable element of any proceeding, either in civil or criminal. And it should be safeguarded from any kind of manhandling, or else it might turn inadmissible in court.
If I submit a printout of some documentary evidence with my objections without 65B, will the bench consider it provided the plaintiff's advocate don't object to its authenticity?
This would be considered as secondary evidence. Therefore, a printout has to be in compliance with Section 65B. With respect to certificates that I was talking about, all those need to be complied with. Then only can it be admissible.
The next is, how can one ensure that the identification test is conducted fairly?
Important ones with
Yes.
respect to that, while conducting a test identification parade would be the number of people who are made to stand in the lineup. Now, the minimum amount should be in a ratio of 1:5. That is, for every one accused, there should be 5 other persons. And the maximum is 1:10, wherein for every one accused, there are 10 people standing in a row.